everybody! We're here today to talk about evidence, which is the next step in the writing process that we're using as we prepare to write an essay. You've come up with a thematic equation that you used to write a thesis statement, and now we need you to support that thesis statement with some evidence. So let's talk about it today. Let's do it. Obviously, when you write an essay and you have an argument that you're making, if you want anybody to take it seriously, you need to support that with evidence. Just the same way if you were having a conversation with a friend and they doubted something you were saying, they'd ask you to provide some sort of evidence. The evidence that we're looking for today must do these things. First of all, it must directly support your thesis statement. So any evidence that you find, you need to be able to relate it to your thesis statement. It should be in the form of a quote from the text. It's okay to paraphrase every once in a while, but the best evidence is usually textual evidence. It's actually taken directly from whatever you're analyzing when it comes to literary analysis. You should also use the fewest words possible. We talked about concision earlier in the writing process, and it's important that when you're finding evidence, you're also being concise. When you take giant block quotes, every English teacher knows you're just trying to fill in the word count. That's what you're doing. So really just try to find the pieces of evidence that are most related to your thesis statement and take the smallest amount of them possible. And then lastly, it needs to be presented in a way that your audience can easily understand it. We need context for that evidence usually. We need an explanation eventually, which will come in the form of commentary, which will be the next video. But you have to present it in a way where the person reading your essay clearly understands why the evidence is there, where it's from in the text, and just they're not confused by it. All right, let's keep going. The first step in finding evidence is actually to go back and review your thesis, because if it's going to support your thesis, you need to look at your thesis and kind of pull it apart and think about what you're looking for. I've written a thesis here for valedictorian, so we can practice this together. When you do the assignment this week, you're actually going to have a thesis provided for you about paper menagerie, and you're going to be asked to find evidence from that story to support a thesis I've given you. But for practice today, we're going to look at valedictorian one more time. So here's my thesis statement for valedictorian. In valedictorian, N.K. Jemisin argues that staying true to one's principles and morals is more important than protecting one's safety. The story follows a high school senior, Zinli, who must choose between the safety of the world she knows and the uncertainty of another that may more closely align to her principles. Jemisin highlights this tension through the repetition of 3 rules by which Zinli lives her life. The first thing to do when you're reviewing your thesis is to look for some key words here. And then we can use those keywords to kind of be the clues that we use to find evidence. Keywords here that I would take from this thesis statement is we have this idea of principles and morals and safety, and repetition and the 3 rules. So when I'm looking for evidence, I should be looking for things that mention the principles or morals by which somebody lives, perhaps something to do with one being safe or not being safe. And then ideally, I might find things that are repeated throughout the text, such as these 3 rules. Got it? So that's our first step, looking at the thesis, trying to pull it apart, and give ourselves kind of a map to use to find the evidence. Our map now are these keywords that we've identified in our thesis. So the next step is to find your quotes. In the end, I think it's always good to look for more evidence than you need, like highlight quotes, use Post-it notes. Since you've got most of these texts in Google Doc form, you can just copy and paste things over from one place to another, but have like a whole arsenal of evidence that you can use, knowing that you might not use all of it, and that's okay. Also use those keywords to help you. So those keywords that we just talked about, in this case, safety, principles, the 3 rules, repetition. Those are the things that I'm going to be looking for, and that I want you to think about right now, because I'm going to ask you in this moment to tell me which of these quotes would be the strongest evidence to support our thesis, keeping in mind these keywords right here. Number 1, rule 3, staying herself, would have brought her to this point anyway. Number 2, she is bleeding, a cut on her forehead, a scrape on one elbow, her lip where she cut it on her own teeth. Number 3, then she remembers rule 2, she will not live in fear, and she pushes this aside. So keeping in mind the keywords that we identified from our thesis statement, safety, principles, 3 rules, repetition, which of these 3 pieces of evidence do you think is strongest? Answer the question right now. 1, 2, or 3. Hopefully you said number one. I believe number one is the strongest. What we do get a little bit is, if you remember the story well enough, you know that what we're talking about is the point that she's being brought to is the decision to continue to be valedictorian and eventually be taken beyond the firewall. So if we know that has to do a little bit with safety. Staying herself is one of her principles. It's got the 3 rules, which is also part of the repetition in the story. So it's kind of meeting all of these. Number 2, it sounds like it's about safety, but we don't really get anything about the principles or the 3 rules or repetition in a way that's helpful here. Number 3 is about the rules, which also meets repetition. You could argue that it's about safety, but in the end, in the entirety of the story, I think number 1 is best. You might go with number 3 too if you're writing a longer essay, but I think number 1 is the best piece of evidence. You shouldn't feel bad about yourself, though, if you chose number 3. You shouldn't feel bad about yourself ever, period, to be honest. You're amazing. You're awesome. Don't forget. So now, once we have a quote, we need to trim that quote down. So with short and timed essays especially, keep your quote short. The essay you're about to write for class is only 500 words, so it's best to keep that essay as short as possible. You couldn't see me. Here I am. Only include the parts that actually pertain to your argument, though, so you don't need the entire quote always, which is what we're going to practice right now, cutting this down. This is already a relatively short quote, so there's not necessarily a ton that we need to cut out, but we still should think about what we can cut out here. I think in the end, for right now, even though this seems important, the important thing that we're probably going to use this quote for is to talk about the repetition of the mention of the rules, which is a thing that comes up again and again, and a thing that I mentioned in the thesis statement, and the fact that really in the end, she was going to do this no matter what because she's sticking to her principles, to her morals. So the specifics of what the rule are oddly a little bit less important than the fact that we're coming back to the rules again, and we know that she's sticking to these rules, and that's sort of what the story is about. So sometimes you're only taking a couple of words out, and you'll see in a second how I take a little bit more out when we get to actually framing the quote, but look for little bits and pieces you can cut out to shorten things down. Okay, then lastly is introducing your quote. And this is a requirement of this week's assignment. You have to introduce the quote. You cannot just drop quotes by themselves. Don't ever just drop a quote all by itself in the middle of an essay. And don't ever just leave the quote as a complete sentence by itself. It needs to be attached to an introduction. Introduce the quote with context. Tell me where in the story are we when this quote occurs? Help me remember where we are so I can make sense of the quote with you. And the best thing to do is to seamlessly integrate the quote into your own writing. So if I read that sentence out loud, it all sounds like it's just one fluid sentence, not like an introduction and then the quote and it's all choppy. Avoid being choppy. And then provide any context that's necessary. So what do I need to understand about what's happening in the story to understand this quote now that you've pulled it out of the story, right? It makes sense to you because you've been doing the work, but to a reader, you need to give them more context sometimes to understand it. Here's what I've done in the end. So at the end of the story, by returning to Zinli's rules after the encounter with Lemuel, Jemison shows us that the rules would have brought her to this point anyway. I know there was a typo up here. I put he and it should be the. We all make mistakes, okay? That's why we add it. Jemison shows us that the rules would have brought her to this point anyway, the point where she knew for certain that she would allow herself to be the plus one. So I start with an introduction that tells me where in the story does this quote occur. It's near the end of the story, but it's also after she's talked to Lemuel for a little bit. Then I've got my quote. You notice I've shortened it a little bit more even. I've really just brought up the fact that this would have brought her to this point anyway. And then in the end, I've given you some additional context to make sure that you're understanding what this quote means. I'm starting to do a little bit of analysis, some commentary, which we'll talk more about next week. But really, I'm just explaining what does she mean by this point? Because you might be confused if you're reading this apart from the story and you don't know the story as well as, say, I do. So that's why I've got the introduction and some context. If you want to get full points for this week's assignment for evidence, you need to do both of those things. Introduce your quote, provide context. It has to happen. You're going to get it returned to you. You're going to have to redo it if you're not doing that. Let's wrap things up. It's usually best to support our thesis with direct textual evidence in the form of quotes. So in general, when you're writing an essay, you should be looking for quotes from the story, not just paraphrasing. You should always be looking for the evidence that best supports your thesis statement. So look for those keywords and think about how you can then find things related to those keywords in your thesis statement. Use that to help guide you. Use the smallest part of the quote possible. So just use quotes that relate to your thesis. And once you find those quotes, try to narrow it down to just like the part of the quote that actually is directly related to that. And then lastly, always provide an introduction for your quote. Don't drop your quote there by itself. Nobody needs to do that. That's mean to do to that quote. It needs to be introduced. Imagine that you were introducing a stranger to your friends and you just left them there all by themselves and didn't take them over and said, hey, this is my friend Carl. Carl's going to feel lonely over there if you don't introduce him. Same with your quotes. And then do your best to seamlessly integrate that quote into your writing. Try to keep it from being super choppy where you're like, introduction, quote, context. Make it all blend together. Work at that. If you got questions, let me know. Otherwise, have a great day.